Today, with part of Broad Street closed for traffic, Friar Street now handles all the bus routes through the town. It was much quieter, though, around the turn of the century. The large building seen here, along on the left, was the Blackgrave buildings. They were replaced when Sainsbury's was built. Watch these as we take a look from the opposite side of Friar Street. Here, standing on the corner of West Street, around 1876, was this boot and shoe warehouse, run by John Palmer. It was soon to be taken over by a well-known Reading family, Langstons. They had already started their business around the corner at 1A West Street. That's the shop on the far right. It's listed in the street directories as the Drapery Warehouse. The extent of their property in 1888, when this picture was taken, includes 93 and 94 Friar Street. But within 2 years they had taken over 95, a butcher's shop next door. Later, the whole corner site was rebuilt and is as we have known it for many years. Interestingly, just before they stopped trading, Mr. Langston told me that behind the covering on the end wall were the tiles from the old butcher's shop. My outstanding memory of the interior were those overhead wires that took little canisters of money from the customer at the point of sale to an office at the rear. Then the cashier, with a pull on a handle, sent it whizzing back again with the receipt and any change. Just for now, we'll go back again to the 1870s. This picture was on the wall in Langston's, the one that covered the butcher's tiles. It gives us an insight into this era. On the left, as already mentioned, was the Blackgrave buildings. These were tenement buildings with steel railings along their front. Then, as a main means of transport in those days were horses, the premises next door, with the arch, was well used. This was Males, the vets. Opposite, at the left centre of the picture, is a pinnacle. This was on the St. Augustine Chapel, which was opened in 1877. Then, just before the turn of the century, they built on this site the new Royal Theatre. Seen here some years later, but before bulls had taken over the adjacent properties. The theatre was well used until it was destroyed by fire in 1937. But inside the charred buildings it was possible to see the windows of the old chapel. Later this area became the back entrance to Woolworth's new site in Broad Street. Here, in early 1989, as the Woolworths Mall, now that's gone. For in late 93, further new buildings have been built on this site. Opposite, in late 1993, was this building, housing on the left Rumberlow's, and next door Brentford's. Watch the bell tower of Greyfriars Church as we turn the clock back 22 years to 1971. Drew's, the ironmongers, were on the corner of Greyfriars Road, with the old Friars pub next door. Then Roy Alder, the baker, Renshaw, the opticians, with Stewart, the ladies' hairdressers, next. Then, when this picture was taken, the last shop before Sainsbury's was Ginorama, outfitters. Looking the other way, these buildings have changed little since the early part of this century. Though the old Friars Inn is recorded back in the 1860s to be the last building in Friar Street before Greyfriars Road, The building of Drew's was at one time number 2 Greyfriars Road, but when Drew's were there, their number was 63A, as the old Friars was 63. However, all this is but a memory, as we come back to 1993. For change again is not far off. We'll move along on the same side. It's still 1993. We gaze at another area, which in 1994 is getting a facelift, Friars Walk. But back in 1972, there stood on this site a real reminder of the past. This grand Victorian building housed C&G Ayres. Records show that as far back as 1827, Giles Ayres was trading as a coal merchant in Horn Street, that's now Southampton Street, and at Bridge Street Wharf. By 1841, Charles, his son, had joined him. Its site was now called Coal Wharf. All movements up to then were by road and barge. But when the railways arrived, their advert states, "In Pantechnicon vans by road, rail and sea." From this position, we can watch over the next 12 months as this area is developed. Demolition is nearly finished. The fence is up around the site. The foundations are in and the building has started. Here, the scaffolding indicates the builder's progress. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning in April 74, they arrived with the escalators for C&A. Needless to say, all traffic was stopped in Friar Street that day. And now 20 years on, Friars Walk is awaiting its first full facelift. Checking on records, it was interesting to find that where C&G Ayres building was, and the Friars Walk is now, in 1842 there was Friars Court, one of some 9 courts that were then in Friar Street. Looking back along the north side, in mid-92, as they prepare for the many bus stops, and with two-way traffic again. Yet it seems no time at all when this picture was taken. It was the last day before going one way. However, let's look along the north side of Friar Street. Just visible from that C&G Ayres van is John James Radio and TV, Royal Assurance, then the well-known 234 Motors with their motorcycles, originally T. Baker, who had been there at the turn of the century. Next, Lovegrove the Undertakers, then Gardner's, which was originally Cox the umbrella maker, with that memorable sign outside. Then Thimbleby and Shortland, who were next to the YMCA, but by this time the old YM had been replaced by that concrete structure and occupied by ICL computers. Whilst here, let's turn down beside the building into Merchant's Place, where halfway down on the left still stands another reminder of the past. the old smithy, who in 1969 was Tibbet, Sons and White. They had taken it over in 1947 from Albert Hussey. He had run it in the days of the horses. We continue on down and turn to the left, into Garrard Street, and on the left is the end of Ayres's sale and storerooms. They took up almost the whole of this side of Garrard Street. Back in Friar Street, and it's mid-1992. HMV had just gone into their newly built premises. These were built to represent those they replaced. Let's see the likeness. It's early in 84, and Rumbelows were there, having taken over from Barnes and Avis in the 60s. Let's check from another angle. Here, on the steps of the cinema opposite, it's May 88. The skyline may be similar, but gone is the character of those windows. Whilst here, we'll look along to Smith's. They too have been rebuilt, and by the same architect. The change is not so noticeable here, though we shall see a difference in the front when we are in Broad Street. However, do you remember it as it was? And when they took over Brahms' fur shop next door, during the alterations. Here's another old bit of Reading that's now all boarded up, the Boar's Head. In the past there were stables down the side, for these inns were used as departing places for coaches and carriers to towns and outlying villages. Record shows that in 1842 Charles Chandler was the innkeeper there, but now that is just history. Leaving the Boar's Head, we make our way along Friar Street. Arriving at St. Lawrence's and the Old Town Hall in 1975, left as it was after the wartime bomb. Watch the curved end of this building as we see it in late 91. The Town Hall returned to its original. But now, in this picture, the end part of Friar Street is disappearing under a JCB. A closer look. The outline of the new Town Hall piazza is taking place. Onward now to November the 11th, 1991. With everyone gathered for the opening ceremony. Victorian dancing around the Queen's statue was watched here by Robert Dimmock, the mayor, after he had declared the area open. 3 years on, and the post office has moved into these premises from across in Friar Street. Though who remembers this corner in 1973? Let's take a look. It was in that building on the corner, long before this picture was taken, that Gilbert Adams, the royal photographer, had his studio. And early in the 19th century, it was a home of the town sergeant. Further down towards the Forbury was Fletcher's for furniture. It's 1994 and we're still trying to accept this site for the General Post Office. However, let's look along to the right of this building. It goes down to Westminster Bank. Watch the corner of the bank as we go back to January 73. Next to the bank was Cooksey and Walker, auctioneers. Then in that distinctive Victorian building this side was the Provincial Insurance. But in between was a well-known Elephant Hotel. It had been there since the last century, as seen in this picture of 1887. Now, 86 years on, it's 1973, and we turn to our right. There's great activity in the old marketplace, for this market, which had been held here since the days of the Abbey, is moving to Hosier Street. Further down, the notices show the storeholders' feelings, as change is often resisted. Now, in 1994, we have a quiet, tree-lined meeting place, and the Hosier Street Market has many more stalls. One interesting feature, when this area was developed, is shown here. The whole of the outside walls, with their characteristic architecture, have been preserved, while the inside is completely demolished. We can see the size of this operation as we look back up the Buttermarket, and all the work involved in preserving these frontages. For, back in 1978, this corner looked like this, from Bull's Ceramics down to the pet shop. Note the upper floors of this building, with its pointed top, as we look back even further to the 1860s. This, as you can see, was before the King's Road junction was moved from lower down in Duke Street. Note that building on the Buttermarket corner. It has the same upper floors, but is now supported by those fine stone arch windows and doors. This is reflected in the buildings further down King Street. As we see it in 1991, looking beyond the junction, at the brick building, centre of picture, it's the then new library on the corner of Abbey Square. Let's take a closer look. As it appeared in late 1990, this was built on the site of the stables for the Abbey. But what of more recent times? Early in 1972, on the corner of Abbey Square was Dartman and Baker, the estate agents. The corner of their building just shows. Next was Walton's, famous for their surgical fittings. Then Perry and Cox, quoted as Reading's oldest sports house. They started in 1838. My memory of their shop was that it was always full of fishing gear. Next were Malcolm Ward with their sound systems, though way back this was Louis Rogers' food store. Then in this picture there is Boutique Maggie, and next was Brian Turner, who sold and serviced small electrical appliances. In the old Cox pickle factory at this time was the Reading Steakhouse and Oxfam, bringing us up to the King's Road Baptist Chapel. This chapel represents the oldest nonconformist place of worship in Reading, which started in Church Street in 1640. Beyond the chapel is a sold notice. This is on the old showrooms of Julian's, car distributors. Now, back to 1990. New buildings stretch right down to the bridge. While on the other side of King's Road, in late '93, this area has been cleared, and as notice states, for the King's Wharf development. But let's look back to this side of the road. In early 1973, on the corner of Highbridge Wharf was Cogan's. Many, I'm sure, will remember Elmer. Before the war, this shop was Mudd's, still an outfitter's. It was the first place I saw in Reading with their name in neon lights. Next door was the china shop. Then, 2 doors down was the well-known model shop of Sleep's. Following on were Williams Furniture, Dunstan and Morton, the TGWU, down to the premises on the corner of Crane Wharf, which at one time was Harris and Russell, electrical wholesalers. Now, back to '93. Standing here on the corner of Abbey Square, we turn to see this view of the new library, with the Holy Brook flowing underneath. Our mind goes back to 1972. The door beside the sign for Abbey Square at one time was a gents' toilet, conveniently sited over the Holy Brook. Back to present times as we turn again and head towards the town, stopping at the corner of Duke Street, the Abbey National corner, and we remember their previous building. This is how it was in the 60s. Looking down Duke Street at the building that juts out, this had been Barnes and Avis. Watch this, as we go back to the 20s. Here their name is visible. They took over this business from Waits in 1911, moving to Friar Street in 1939. But on the corner here is Jackson's Hardware and Household Store. They were here from 1899 to 1927. Now it's back to 1993. We turn and head for the town centre. Pausing at the junction of Minster Street, we look along the windows of this bookshop, and on the far left is a black doorway, enlarged when this area was developed for the Mansfield shoe shop in 1905. But, as the name on the door states, it was the entrance to Walsingham House. This was built in 1630, and it is said Queen Elizabeth I stayed here on her visits to Reading. In later years it was Hounslows, then Speedwell, a Reading car manufacturer. As we rush past, we can look at that door and visualize the Queen leisurely entering there. We head now to that part of Broad Street that has become pedestrianised. Here in August '94, this end still waits its trees. But compare it as it was in '87. On a Sunday, with no traffic nor pedestrians, let's look at that brick-faced building in the centre on the left. From the doorway of Boots, it's 1994, and Abbey National are in there. Yet it had many occupiers, such as Fosters and Knights. But for many years it was a Cadena, a much-used restaurant. Then in the 20s it was a car showroom for Vincent's. Looking even further back, we see it when it was Reading's Grand Cinema. Standing now outside this building, we come up to date as we look at the other side of Broad Street. Smiths, with their rebuilt frontage. Unlike Friar Street, their architects here have preserved that original Victorian style. Watch Smith's building on the right is number 38. As we look back 6 years. Before Smiths took over this property, it had been Hills for toys, prams and leather goods, and that plain wall had been a large windows. Watch now the floors above this, as we come up to date again. It's impossible to believe that the whole of these buildings were demolished before they were rebuilt. Further along Broad Street, we look back just 2 years with that one pedestrian crossing. (1994) and the finished part of this pedestrianisation. Whilst we think back to Christmas '89, here Littlewoods have that old red front, and Woolworths have turned their store into a franchise mall. Then the building next door, which was Wimpy's. Watch this as we turn the clock back to 1888. There it stands, surrounded by all those earlier 19th century shops and houses. Yet 8 years earlier, we're at the corner of St Mary's Butts. The sign on the right is on the building that in 1994 is Lower Ashley. Looking along the north side of Broad Street, the building this side of the ones with the blinds is the ones where Wimpy was. Further on down, just right of centre, is the Green Girls' School. Today on that site is Dixon's. This is May 1994, and freedom for the shopper, at least between 11 and 4. On the left is Woolies' new building. Watch this as we look back to Christmas '89. Here it is, the Woolworths Mill. On to 1994. Let us now watch Littlewoods and Dixon's as we take a step back further, into the 50s. On that site, then, was the well-known store of Bulls, who closed in 1953. Like Littlewoods, they went through to Friar Street. Here too is the original style of Woolworths. They had moved here in 1939 from further down Broad Street near Union Street. Moving over to Woolworths entrance, we again survey this pedestrian area. Our memories drift back to those days of traffic. Returning to 1994, turn and look across to this corner with Laura Ashley. We again turn the clock back to 1968. Bayliss', whose store went round into St Mary's Butts. In the background is part of the White Hart. Watch it as we come up to date. With Virgin in that part of Broad Street Mall. Crossing over to the corner opposite, we look towards Broad Street. And again we recall this scene in the early 60s. Yet, in between these two scenes, we tend to forget those days while these changes took place. Dust and noise, with hardly any room to walk. Then on the 17th of May, 1994, around lunchtime, coach and horses brought the mayor, Rangy-Sofel, down to the centre to carry out practically his last ceremony as mayor, the unveiling of the completion plaque. As we stand and read its inscriptions, our thoughts of the past change to those of the future.